The horse would not move. Nathaniel had never seen his stallion refuse a command before dawn had even broken over the fields of Rothbury. The animal stood still as stone near the edge of the training paddock, ears forward, nostrils flaring, and would not step aside no matter how firmly the stable master pulled at the reins. Something was wrong. Nathaniel felt it before he understood it, the way a man feels a storm before the first cloud appears. He walked out into the cold morning himself, boots crushing frost across the grass, and stopped when he saw what the horse was guarding. A woman lay curled against the animal's front legs, her cloak damp with dew, her dark hair loose and tangled across her face. She did not move. For one terrible moment, Nathaniel thought she was dead. He crouched beside her, his heart pounding harder than it had in years, and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse, faint but steady. Relief loosened something tight in his chest, though he could not explain why a stranger's survival mattered so much to him. "Fetch Mrs. Hargrove," he said sharply to the stable boy hovering nearby. "Now." The boy ran. Nathaniel lifted the woman carefully, surprised by how light she was, as though she had not eaten properly in days. Her face, even pale and drawn, held a kind of quiet strength that unsettled him. This was not a woman who fainted from delicate nerves. Something had driven her to this field, to this exhaustion, to this horse who had somehow decided, without instruction from anyone, that she was worth protecting. He carried her into the house himself, ignoring the startled looks of the servants gathering in the hallway. Mrs. Hargrove met him at the base of the stairs, her expression sharpening the moment she saw the stranger in his arms. "Your Grace, who is this?" "I do not know," Nathaniel admitted. "My horse would not let anyone near her until I came." Mrs. Hargrove did not ask further questions. She simply directed him to the guest room nearest the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, and began issuing orders for hot water, blankets, and broth. Nathaniel lingered in the doorway longer than he intended, watching the housekeeper work, his mind circling the strange scene in the paddock again and again. He told himself it was concern for a woman found in danger on his land, nothing more. A duke had responsibilities, and one of them was the safety of anyone found within his boundaries, whether invited or not. But he did not quite believe himself. It was nearly 2 hours before she woke. Nathaniel had gone about his morning correspondence, or tried to, sitting at his desk with a pen in hand and no memory of what he had written. When Mrs. Hargrove appeared at his study door and said the woman was awake and asking to speak with him, he stood so quickly his chair nearly toppled. He found her sitting upright in the bed, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her dark eyes alert despite the exhaustion still etched into her face. She did not look at him with fear, or gratitude, or the confusion he expected from someone waking in a stranger's house. She looked at him with suspicion. "Has anyone come looking for me?" she asked, before he could offer a single word of greeting. Nathaniel blinked. Of all the things he had imagined she might say, that was not among them. "I beg your pardon?" "A man," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Tall, fair-haired, likely well-dressed. Has anyone matching that description come to your gates this morning?" "No one has come to my gates at all," Nathaniel said carefully. "You are safe here. My name is Nathaniel Ashworth. This is Rothbury Hall." Something flickered across her face at the word Duke, a flash of calculation quickly hidden. She was intelligent, he realized. Whoever she was already measuring the danger and the opportunity of her situation, even half collapsed in a stranger's bed. "My name is Margaret," she said finally. "Margaret Whitfield. I am sorry to have caused such trouble. I will leave as soon as I am able." "You collapsed in my paddock in the middle of the night," Nathaniel said. "You will leave when you are well, not a moment before. Perhaps you might tell me how you came to be there in the first place." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I would rather not say, Your Grace." "You do not trust me." "I do not trust anyone," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only plain fact, stated as simply as the weather. "It has kept me alive this long." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him, who smiled and flattered, and waited for the right moment to ask for money, favors, marriage. This woman, half-starved and trembling in a stranger's house, wanted nothing from him at all. She wanted only to be left alone, and she was prepared to walk back out into the cold to secure that solitude if he pushed her too hard. It was, he found, oddly refreshing. "Very well," he said. "You need not explain yourself today, but you will eat, and you will rest, and you will allow my housekeeper to tend to you properly before you attempt to walk anywhere again. That horse outside would not let a single soul near you until I arrived. I suspect he would be quite unhappy if I let you leave in this condition." For the first time, Something like the ghost of a smile touched Margaret's mouth. "Your horse has better manners than most gentlemen I have known." "He has a discerning eye," Nathaniel said. "Perhaps I ought to trust his judgment more often." Mrs. Hargrove returned then with a tray of broth and bread, and Nathaniel excused himself, though he found it strangely difficult to leave the room. Outside in the corridor, he stood for a moment with his back against the wall, turning over what had just happened. A stranger had appeared on his land, guarded by his own horse, asking not for help, but for warning of danger. She had given him a name, and nothing else. Everything about her demanded answers he did not yet have. He thought of Beatrice, his intended, who was expected to arrive within the week to finalize wedding arrangements neither of them had chosen with any real enthusiasm. He thought of the quiet, empty years stretching ahead of him, filled with obligation and very little else. And then he thought of Margaret's eyes, sharp and wary even in exhaustion, asking if anyone had come looking for her. Someone was looking for her, he was certain of it. And whoever that man was, Nathaniel found himself already disliking him with an intensity that surprised him. He returned to his study, but the correspondence on his desk no longer held his attention. Instead, he sent a quiet instruction to his steward. Any stranger arriving at the gates asking after a woman was to be reported to him immediately, and turned away without explanation. He did not know yet what he was protecting, or why it mattered so much. But the horse had made its choice before he had, standing guard over a stranger in the cold morning light, and Nathaniel found he was not inclined to argue with it. By evening, word reached him that a rider had been seen at the edge of the estate, watching the house from a distance before turning back into the trees. Nathaniel stood at his study window long after the light had faded, staring out at the dark tree line, and felt certain that whatever had brought Margaret Whitfield to his door was far from finished. Whoever was searching for her would return, and when he did, Nathaniel intended to be ready. He had not always been a man who noticed such things. Once, years ago, he had been careless with his trust, generous with his affection, certain that the world would treat kindness with kindness in return. That certainty had been broken by a woman he no longer allowed himself to think about, a woman whose smile had hidden calculations sharper than any blade. Since then, Nathaniel had built his life around careful distance. He measured every guest, every letter, every proposal of marriage or business with the same cold precision, and he had believed, until this morning, that nothing could disturb that careful order again. Margaret Whitfield had disturbed it in the space of a single sentence. He found himself walking down to the stables again before retiring for the night, though he told himself it was only to check on the horse. The animal stood calmly now in its stall, nosing at a bucket of oats, utterly unbothered by the events of the morning. Nathaniel rested a hand against its neck and found himself speaking aloud, quietly, to the only creature on the estate who had already decided that Margaret was worth protecting. "You knew something the rest of us did not," he murmured. "What was it you saw in her?" The horse only huffed and returned to its oats, offering no answers, though Nathaniel did not truly need one. He had seen it himself in the brief moments they had spoken. A woman running not from foolishness or scandal of her own making, but from something, or someone, that frightened her enough to sleep in a stranger's field rather than risk being found on the open road. He thought of the countless women who had been paraded before him since his father's death, each one polished and rehearsed, each one aware of exactly what a duke's attention was worth. Margaret had shown him nothing but suspicion and a plain, unvarnished request for information. She had not once asked what his title meant, or what his estate was worth, or whether he was already promised to another. She had asked only if danger had followed her through his gates. It struck him, standing there in the quiet stable with the smell of hay and horse thick in the air, that he did not even know what she looked like when she was not exhausted and afraid. He found that he wanted to. Back inside the house, Mrs. Hargrove intercepted him in the hallway with a report on their guest. Margaret had eaten a full bowl of broth, asked for nothing further, and had fallen back asleep almost immediately, though not before insisting, twice, that she intended to leave at first light. "She will not leave at first light," Nathaniel said. "See that the door to her room does not lock from the outside. I will not have her feel a prisoner here, but keep a servant nearby through the night, in case that rider returns." Mrs. Hargrove studied him with the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had served the family for 30 years and had seen every version of Nathaniel Ashworth there was to see. "You are taking a great deal of care for a stranger, Your Grace." "She is a guest in danger on my land," Nathaniel said, more firmly than the moment required. "It is a matter of duty." "Of course," Mrs. Hargrove said, in the tone of a woman who believed nothing of the sort, but had long ago learned when to hold her tongue. Nathaniel retired to his own chambers that night, but sleep came slowly, and left him restless with half-formed questions. Somewhere down the corridor, a stranger slept in his house, guarded by his own horse and his own quiet, unexplainable resolve. Somewhere beyond his gates, a man on horseback watched the tree line, waiting for an opportunity Nathaniel intended to deny him. Whatever tomorrow brought, he understood, with a certainty that unsettled him more than the mystery itself, that his carefully ordered life had already begun to change. Margaret did not leave at first light. She woke to sunlight cutting through unfamiliar curtains and, for a moment, forgot where she was. Then memory returned in a rush, the cold field, the stallion standing over her like a silent guardian, the Duke's steady voice asking who she was. She sat up too quickly, and the room tilted before settling again. A young maid appeared almost instantly, carrying a fresh basin of water and a modest gray dress that fit Margaret's frame closely enough to suggest careful measuring while she slept. "Mrs. Hargrove asked me to see you were comfortable, miss. Breakfast is ready whenever you are able." Margaret thanked her, though the kindness unsettled her more than cruelty would have. She had grown used to households where kindness was a transaction, offered only in exchange for something owed later. She dressed slowly, testing her strength, and made her way downstairs with careful steps, determined to leave before she became any further indebted to strangers. She found the Duke of Rothbury already in the breakfast room, a newspaper folded beside his plate, untouched. He rose the moment she entered, a small courtesy that surprised her more than it should have. "You look considerably better than you did yesterday morning," he said. "I am grateful for your hospitality, Your Grace. I intend to leave within the hour." "Do you?" Nathaniel said, not quite a question. He gestured for her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. "Where will you go?" Margaret's fingers tightened briefly around the edge of the table before she forced them still. "That is not your concern. You collapsed on my land, guarded by my horse, asking whether a dangerous man had followed you here. I would say it has become somewhat my concern." His voice was calm, without accusation, but there was a steadiness in it that made evasion difficult. "I am not asking out of idle curiosity, Miss Whitfield. I am asking because a rider was seen at the edge of my estate yesterday evening, watching the house." Margaret went very still. Fair-haired, well-dressed? I could not say from that distance. But he did not approach, and he did not leave quickly either. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, some of the guarded composure had cracked, revealing exhaustion far deeper than a single night's sleep could mend. "His name is Edmund Price. I was employed as governess to his younger sister for the past 2 years. He began paying attention to me in ways that were not appropriate, and when I refused him, he threatened to tell his mother that I had stolen from the household, unless I agreed to leave with him quietly and become something I have no wish to become." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, a flash of something sharp and protective crossing his expression before he mastered it. "And instead you ran." "I had very little choice. A governess accused of theft has no defense worth speaking of, whether the accusation is true or not. I would have been dismissed without reference, unable to find honest work again, so I left in the night, with what little I could carry, and I have been walking for 3 days. 3 days, Nathaniel repeated, something in his voice tightening further. "Without proper food or shelter. I managed." "You collapsed in a field." Margaret's chin lifted, some of her old defiance returning. "And I am grateful your horse found me before anyone else did, but I cannot stay here, Your Grace. If Edmund learns I have taken refuge with a duke, he will use it against both of us. Men like him thrive on scandal, and I will not be the cause of yours." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he said, "I have a proposal, if you will hear it. I am wary of proposals from gentlemen just now." A faint, unexpected smile touched his mouth. "A fair point. This one concerns my correspondence, not my affections. I receive a considerable volume of letters in French and Italian, from estates and business contacts abroad, and my previous translator left my employ some months ago. If you possess the education I suspect you do, you could take up the position temporarily. It would give you a reason to remain here that has nothing to do with charity, and everything to do with honest work." Margaret studied him carefully, searching for the trap she was certain must be hidden somewhere in the offer. "Why would you help me?" "Because a woman who spent 3 days on the road rather than accept dishonor at the hands of a man like Edmund Price deserves more consideration than the world has given her," Nathaniel said simply. "And because my horse, it seems, has better judgment than most people I employ." Despite herself, Margaret felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "That is twice now you have credited your horse with more sense than your household." "He has yet to disappoint me." She hesitated, weighing the offer against every instinct that told her to trust no one, to keep moving, to never let herself depend on the goodwill of a man with power over her circumstances. But 3 days on the road had left her body weak and her options thin, and the alternative to accepting his offer was returning to a road where Edmund's man might find her again. "I will accept," she said finally, "on the condition that this is understood to be employment, and nothing more. I will not be a guest living on your charity. I will earn my place here." "Agreed," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice suggested he respected that condition more than he would have respected easy gratitude. Their arrangement might have settled quietly into routine had the drawing room doors not opened at that exact moment to admit Lady Beatrice Colville, unannounced, her traveling cloak still dusted with the road, her sharp eyes finding Margaret at the table before they found Nathaniel at all. "I did not realize you had company, Nathaniel," Beatrice said, her tone pleasant on the surface and cool underneath, the way ice looks smooth before a foot breaks through it. "Introduce me, won't you?" Nathaniel rose, his expression settling into the careful neutrality Margaret would come to recognize as his armor. "Beatrice, this is Miss Margaret Whitfield. She has agreed to assist with my foreign correspondence. Margaret, Lady Beatrice Colville." "How fortunate," Beatrice said, her gaze sweeping over Margaret's borrowed dress with a precision that missed nothing, "to find household help so easily arranged. Though I confess I did not expect to arrive and find you breakfasting with her, rather than waiting for my letter announcing my visit." "Your letter arrived only this morning, alongside you," Nathaniel said evenly. "I was not expecting you until Thursday." "I found I could not wait," Beatrice said, and though her smile remained fixed in place, her eyes lingered on Margaret a moment longer than courtesy required, cool and assessing, the look of a woman recalculating a plan she had believed was already settled. Margaret excused herself as soon as she reasonably could, retreating to the small study Mrs. Hargrove showed her, where stacks of correspondence waited in French, Italian, and a scattering of other languages she recognized from her father's old books. She sat at the desk, grateful for the distraction of honest work, and tried not to think about the way Beatrice's eyes had followed her from the room, or the strange, unfamiliar warmth she had felt when Nathaniel defended the timing of the visit without being asked. She told herself it meant nothing. She was an employee, nothing more, in a house she intended to leave the moment it was safe to do so. But some quiet, unguarded part of her did not quite believe it, and that frightened her more than Edmund Price ever had. Outside, unnoticed by anyone in the house, a rider paused once more at the edge of the tree line, watching the windows of Rothbury Hall with patient, calculating eyes, before turning his horse back toward the road. The afternoon passed slowly for Margaret, though she was grateful for the work. Translating letters gave her hands something to do and her mind something to focus on besides the uneasy weight of Beatrice's arrival. She worked through a stack of correspondence from a wine merchant in Bordeaux, then a longer letter from an Italian silk trader disputing the terms of a shipment, her pen moving steadily across fresh paper as she rendered each sentence into clear, precise English. It was honest work, the kind she had not been permitted to do in Edmund's household, where her only task had been to smile politely and pretend not to notice the way his eyes followed her across a room. She had almost convinced herself that the afternoon would pass without incident when Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the study door, her expression carefully neutral in the way of a woman accustomed to delivering difficult news gently. "Lady Beatrice has asked to speak with you, miss. She is in the east parlor." Margaret's stomach tightened, but she nodded and set down her pen. There was no reasonable way to refuse the request of a duke's intended without drawing more attention than she wished, so she smoothed her borrowed dress and made her way to the parlor, bracing herself for whatever awaited. Beatrice sat near the window, a cup of tea untouched before her, her posture perfectly composed in the manner of a woman who had spent her entire life being watched, and had long ago mastered the art of appearing at ease, even when she was not. She gestured for Margaret to sit, and Margaret did, choosing the chair farthest from the window out of some instinct she could not quite name. "You must forgive my curiosity," Beatrice said, once the door had closed behind them. "It is not every day I arrive to find a stranger already settled so comfortably into Nathaniel's household. Tell me, Miss Whitfield, how exactly did you come to be his translator?" "I was in need of employment, my lady, and His Grace required assistance with foreign correspondence. The arrangement was made only this morning." "How convenient," Beatrice said, her smile thin. "And where were you employed before this sudden arrangement?" Margaret kept her expression carefully still, though the question landed exactly where she feared it would. "I served as a governess, my lady, in a household some distance from here. Circumstances made it necessary for me to seek new employment." "What sort of circumstances?" "Personal ones," Margaret said. allowing just enough coolness into her voice to discourage further questioning, though she doubted it would work. Women like Beatrice did not abandon a scent once they had caught it. Beatrice studied her for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over Margaret's face and hands with the precision of someone accustomed to reading people the way others read books. You have the manner of someone with education beyond a common governess. Careful speech, careful posture. Whoever raised you took some pains with your upbringing, even if fortune has since been unkind. My father was a vicar, Margaret said, before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted offering even that much. He believed education was owed to daughters as much as sons. How admirable, Beatrice said, though the word carried no warmth at all. It must be a difficult adjustment then, finding yourself dependent on a stranger's charity. It is employment, my lady, not charity. I intend to earn my keep honestly, and nothing more. Something flickered behind Beatrice's eyes, quick and calculating, gone before Margaret could name it. Of course, how practical of you. She lifted her tea at last, though she did not drink, merely held the cup as though it gave her something to do with her hands while her mind worked elsewhere. I do hope you understand, Miss Whitfield, that Nathaniel and I have been promised to one another for some time. Our families arranged the match years ago, before either of us had much say in the matter, but arrangements of that kind carry considerable weight. I would hate for any misunderstanding to arise regarding your position here. There is no misunderstanding on my part, my lady, Margaret said evenly. I am here to translate letters, nothing more. Good, Beatrice said, setting down her cup with a small, deliberate click against the saucer. I find misunderstandings tend to cause a great deal of unnecessary difficulty for everyone involved. The conversation ended there, though Margaret left the parlor with the distinct impression that Beatrice had learned exactly as much as she intended to, and perhaps more than Margaret had meant to reveal. She returned to the study with her thoughts unsettled, the stack of letters no longer holding the same welcome distraction it had that morning. She did not see Nathaniel again until dinner, a formal affair with Beatrice seated at his right hand and Margaret placed, at Mrs. Hargrove's careful arrangement, near the far end of the table among a handful of estate guests who had arrived for business matters unrelated to the household's private dramas. She watched Nathaniel across the length of polished mahogany, noting the careful, practiced courtesy he extended to Beatrice, a courtesy that held none of the warmth she had heard in his voice that morning when he had asked where she intended to go. It was not her place to notice such things. She reminded herself of that fact several times throughout the meal, and found the reminder growing less convincing with each repetition. After dinner, as the guests dispersed and Beatrice retired early, claiming fatigue from her journey, Nathaniel found Margaret in the corridor near the study, a stack of finished translations in her arms. You survived Beatrice's interrogation, I take it, he said, a note of dry humor in his voice that surprised her. I did not realize it would be quite so thorough, Margaret admitted. She is thorough about everything. It is, in its way, an admirable quality, though not always a comfortable one to be near. He glanced toward the darkened windows, his expression sobering. A rider was seen again near the tree line this evening. My steward believes it may be the same man from yesterday. Margaret's arms tightened around the papers she carried. Edmund, likely. I have instructed the gatekeepers to turn away anyone who cannot state clear and legitimate business, and to send word to me immediately if the same man is seen a third time. He hesitated, then added, more quietly, You are safe within these walls, Margaret. Whatever comes, I intend to see that remains true. She looked up at him, searching his face for the calculation she expected to find there, the hidden price of his protection that every kindness in her experience had eventually demanded. She found none, only steady, quiet resolve, and something else beneath it she was not yet ready to name. Thank you, she said softly, and meant it more than she had meant to. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Margaret lay awake in her borrowed room, listening to the wind move through the trees beyond her window, and wondered how much longer her fragile safety could hold before the world outside came crashing through it. 2 weeks passed, and Rothbury Hall settled into an uneasy rhythm. Margaret rose early each morning to work through the stack of correspondence waiting on her desk, her translations growing faster and more confident with each passing day. She learned the rhythms of the house, the creak of the third stair, the hour Mrs. Hargrove took her tea, the way sunlight moved through the study window in the late afternoon and turned the dust motes gold. It was, in its quiet way, the first place in years that had begun to feel less like a battlefield and more like a home, though she was careful never to say so aloud. Nathaniel found reasons to visit the study more often than his correspondence strictly required. He told himself, each time, that he was simply checking on the progress of the translations, or discussing a point of phrasing that seemed unclear, or bringing a fresh letter that had arrived that morning. He did not examine too closely why these visits had begun to occupy a portion of his day he had never before set aside for anything but business. "Your Italian is better than my last translator's," he said one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe with a letter in hand. He used to render half the idioms literally. "I once received a letter that claimed a shipment had, and I quote, fallen into the mouth of the wolf." Margaret laughed, a sound that surprised them both with its unguarded warmth. "That would be an expression meaning to wish someone luck, Your Grace. Rather like saying break a leg in English. Your previous translator seems to have missed the meaning entirely." I gathered as much, eventually, after writing back a rather confused reply about wolves. Nathaniel crossed the room and set the letter on her desk. "This one arrived this morning. Business from Vienna, I believe, though I confess my grasp of German is worse than my Italian." Margaret took the letter and scanned it quickly. "A proposal regarding timber exports. Fairly straightforward, though the terms in the third paragraph are unusually generous. You may wish to have your steward review the figures before agreeing to anything. You noticed that in a single reading? My father kept careful accounts for the parish, and taught me to do the same. Numbers rarely lie, even when the words around them try to." Nathaniel studied her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "You are wasted as a translator, Margaret. You have the mind of a business partner." "A woman with the mind of a business partner is rarely given the chance to prove it," Margaret said, though there was no bitterness in the observation, only plain, weary fact. "Perhaps that is the world's failing, rather than yours." She looked up at him then, something warm and startled crossing her face, before she carefully smoothed it away, and returned her attention to the letter as though the moment had not happened at all. Nathaniel, for his part, found himself unwilling to leave the study as quickly as he had intended, lingering instead to discuss the finer points of the Vienna proposal far longer than the subject truly warranted. These small exchanges accumulated, day by day, into something neither of them named but both began to feel. Margaret found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridor. Nathaniel found himself composing questions about foreign trade simply to have an excuse to visit the study. Neither spoke of it, though Mrs. Hargrove, watching from her long years of quiet observation, began to smile to herself more often than either of them noticed. Beatrice noticed everything. She said nothing directly, choosing instead the slow, patient work of gathering information through servants' gossip and carefully phrased questions dropped into casual conversation. She learned, within a fortnight, that Margaret had once been employed by a family named Price, and that her departure had been sudden and unexplained. She learned that a rider matching no one's clear description had been seen near the estate boundary on 3 separate occasions, always at dusk, always watching, never approaching. She began, quietly, to write letters of her own. Margaret remained unaware of this correspondence, occupied instead with the growing, cautious warmth of her days at Rothbury Hall. She had begun, despite every instinct warning her against it, to trust Nathaniel in small, careful increments. She trusted him to keep his word about the gates. She trusted him not to ask questions she was not ready to answer. She trusted, most dangerously of all, the way his expression softened when he thought she was not watching him. One evening, as autumn rain drummed steadily against the study windows, Nathaniel found her still working long after the dinner hour had passed, a single candle burning low beside a stack of nearly finished letters. "You should have stopped an hour ago," he said, settling into the chair opposite her desk without invitation, a habit that had become comfortable between them without either quite deciding it should be. "The Vienna letters needed finishing before tomorrow's post," Margaret said, though she set down her pen gratefully enough, rubbing at the ache building behind her eyes. "The Vienna letters can wait a day. You cannot work yourself into exhaustion twice in 1 month, Margaret. I would rather lose a week of correspondence than have my horse guarding you in a field again." Despite herself, she smiled. "You bring up that horse rather often, Your Grace. He has earned the right to be mentioned. Were it not for his stubbornness, I might never have found you at all." Nathaniel's tone grew quieter, more serious. "I have been meaning to ask you something, and I have put it off longer than I should have. What happened with Edmund Price exactly? Not the summary you gave me that first morning. All of it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. He began his attentions gradually, so gradually I barely noticed at first. A compliment here, a lingering glance there. I told myself it was harmless, the sort of thing a young man says without meaning anything by it. But it grew. He began finding excuses to be alone with me, contriving reasons for his sister's lessons to run longer, appearing in rooms he had no cause to enter. When I finally made clear that his attentions were unwelcome, he did not accept it gracefully. What did he do? He told me that if I refused him, he would tell his mother I had been stealing from the household. Small things, at first, easily believed. Jewelry and coin left carelessly about, the sort of theft a desperate governess might commit. He had already begun laying the groundwork, I later learned, misplacing items and allowing suspicion to fall quietly in my direction over the preceding weeks. He had planned this long before he ever spoke the threat aloud. Nathaniel's expression had gone hard, a controlled anger simmering beneath his usual composure. And his mother would have believed him. Without question, a duke's word carries weight against a servant's denial, and Edmund's family, though not titled so grandly, held enough standing in their county that no magistrate would have troubled himself to examine the matter closely. I would have been dismissed without reference, likely facing prosecution, my entire future destroyed on the word of a man whose only crime was being refused. Margaret's voice remained steady, though something raw moved beneath it, so I left. I took what little I had saved and walked, hoping to reach a town large enough to find honest work under a different name if necessary, far from anyone who might recognize the accusation before I had a chance to explain myself. 3 days on foot, Nathaniel said quietly. You could have died in that field. I very nearly did. She met his eyes then, something fragile and honest passing between them. Your horse saved my life, Your Grace. As much as you did. I have not forgotten that. Nathaniel reached across the desk, an instinctive gesture, and covered her hand briefly with his own, before seeming to catch himself and withdrawing. You are safe here, Margaret. I meant what I said before. Whatever Edmund Price intends, he will find it considerably harder to reach you within these walls than he anticipated. I have already spoken to my steward about strengthening the watch at every gate, and I do not intend to relax that vigilance until the matter is fully resolved, whatever form that resolution ultimately takes. I hope you are right, Margaret said softly. But men like Edmund do not give up easily. He has invested too much in controlling the narrative of my disappearance to let it end quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain continuing its steady rhythm against the glass, the candle between them burning lower still. Neither moved to end the conversation, though both understood, without needing to say it, that something had shifted in the space between them, something neither was yet prepared to name. It was Mrs. Hargrove's soft knock at the door that finally broke the moment, the housekeeper informing Nathaniel that Lady Beatrice had asked after him, wondering at his prolonged absence from the drawing room. Nathaniel rose reluctantly, offering Margaret a final lingering glance before he departed, and Margaret sat alone in the study long after his footsteps had faded, her heart beating with a confusion she did not fully understand and was not yet ready to examine. Down the corridor, in the drawing room, Beatrice waited with a folded letter tucked carefully into her sleeve, addressed to a household some distance away, ready to be sent with the morning post. She had learned enough, she believed, to secure her own position, and if that meant ensuring Margaret Whitfield's past caught up with her sooner rather than later, Beatrice found she felt very little guilt about it at all. The following morning brought clear skies after the storm, though the ground remained soft and muddy beneath a pale wash of autumn sunlight. Margaret rose early, as had become her habit, and found herself drawn not to the study but toward the stables, some quiet impulse pulling her to see the horse who had first found her in the frost. The stallion greeted her with a low, familiar sound, pressing his nose against her palm as though the two of them had known each other far longer than a few short weeks. Margaret stroked his neck slowly, grateful for the simple, undemanding comfort of the animal's presence. You have made a habit of visiting him. Nathaniel's voice came from the stable doorway, and Margaret turned to find him watching her, his coat still damp from an early ride across the eastern fields. He seems to expect it now, Margaret said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. I confess I have grown rather fond of him. He returns the sentiment, I think. He has never taken to strangers so quickly before. My father used to say a good horse could read a person's character better than any physician could read their pulse. Nathaniel stepped closer, running a hand along the stallion's flank with easy familiarity. He trusted very few people. You should consider that a compliment, Margaret. I do, she said softly. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the horse's steady breathing, and the distant call of birds settling into the hedgerows beyond the stable yard. It was Nathaniel who finally spoke again, his tone more careful than before. I received word this morning that Beatrice intends to extend her visit. She had originally planned to return home within the week, but now speaks of remaining through the month, to better acquaint herself with the household before our wedding date is finalized. Margaret kept her eyes on the horse, unwilling to let her expression betray whatever complicated feeling rose in her chest at his words. That seems a sensible arrangement, given the importance of the match. "Does it?" Nathaniel said, and there was something weary in his voice that Margaret had not heard before. "I confess I find myself less certain of that sensibility with each passing day." She turned to look at him then, surprised by the admission. "Your Grace, you need not explain your arrangements to me. Perhaps I do not need to, but I find myself wanting to, regardless." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before he seemed to catch himself and stepped back, clearing his throat. "Forgive me, that was not appropriate." "There is nothing to forgive," Margaret said quietly, though her heart beat faster than she cared to admit. He left her there with the horse, and Margaret watched him go, her thoughts tangled between duty and something far more dangerous than duty had ever been. That afternoon, while Margaret worked through a fresh stack of letters, Mrs. Hargrove appeared unannounced at the study door, closing it carefully behind her before speaking. "Miss Whitfield, I hope you will forgive an old woman's interference, but I feel I must ask you something directly." Margaret set down her pen, sensing the seriousness in the housekeeper's tone. "Of course, Mrs. Hargrove." "Lady Beatrice has been asking a great many questions of the staff these past days. Questions about your former employment, about the family named Price, about the nature of your departure from their household." Mrs. Hargrove's expression was troubled. "I do not believe her curiosity is entirely innocent, miss. I have served this family long enough to recognize when someone is building a case against another, rather than simply making conversation." Margaret's stomach tightened with cold dread. "What has she learned?" "I could not say for certain, but she has written at least one letter I know of, sent with yesterday's post to an address I did not recognize, though it was not local. I thought you deserved to know, given the circumstances you described to His Grace." "You know of my circumstances?" "His Grace does not confide easily, Miss Whitfield, but 30 years in this household has taught me to read what is not said as clearly as what is. I know enough to understand you are in danger, and I know enough to see that Lady Beatrice may not have your best interests at heart." Mrs. Hargrove's voice softened. "I only wish to warn you, so that whatever comes, it does not come as a complete surprise." Margaret thanked her, though the warning settled heavily over the rest of her afternoon, every letter she translated afterward feeling smaller and less important against the growing shadow of Beatrice's quiet investigation. She thought of Edmund's threats, of the accusation of theft waiting to be spoken the moment he found sufficient leverage, and wondered how much longer her fragile peace at Rothbury Hall could possibly last. She did not see Nathaniel again until dinner, where Beatrice was unusually attentive toward her, asking pointed questions about her father's parish and the exact county of her birth, questions phrased with such careful casualness that only someone already warned would have recognized the calculation beneath them. Margaret answered as vaguely as courtesy allowed, aware of Nathaniel watching the exchange with a furrowed brow, though he said nothing to interrupt it. Later, as the guests dispersed for the evening, Nathaniel caught Margaret's arm gently in the corridor. "You seem distracted at dinner. Is something troubling you?" Margaret hesitated, weighing how much to share, before deciding that honesty, at this point, mattered more than caution. "Mrs. Hargrove tells me Lady Beatrice has been asking questions about my past, and has sent at least one letter to an address none of the staff recognized. I fear she suspects something, and intends to use it against me." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "I will speak with her." "Please do not," Margaret said quickly. "If she suspects you are protecting me beyond the bounds of simple employment, it will only confirm whatever she already believes. Let me handle this quietly, if I can. I do not like watching you carry this burden alone. I have carried heavier burdens alone before, Your Grace. I will manage this one as well." Margaret offered a small, tired smile, though it did not quite banish the worry in her eyes. "But I thank you for the concern. It means more than you likely realize." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something fierce and protective moving behind his careful composure, before he finally nodded, though the reluctance in his expression suggested the matter was far from settled in his own mind. He walked her to the base of the stairs in silence, and at the last moment, before she ascended, he spoke again, quietly, as though the words had escaped before he could stop them. "Whatever happens with Beatrice, whatever happens with Edmund, know that you are not facing it alone anymore, Margaret." "I do not say that lightly." She held his gaze for a long breath, unable to find words equal to the feeling rising in her chest, and simply nodded before climbing the stairs, leaving him standing there in the quiet hall, watching until she disappeared from sight. The rain returned that night, steady and unbroken, while 3 separate people within Rothbury Hall lay awake with thoughts that would, within days, collide with consequences none of them could yet fully foresee. 3 days later, Edmund Price arrived at the front gates of Rothbury Hall, and this time, He did not stay hidden among the trees. He came in the early afternoon, dressed with careful elegance, presenting himself to the gatekeeper as a family friend, seeking a private audience with the Duke on a matter of some urgency. Nathaniel, informed immediately by a breathless stable boy, felt a cold, familiar anger settle over him even before he had confirmed the visitor's name. He received Edmund in the formal drawing room, choosing the setting deliberately, wanting the distance and the cold formality of the space between them. Edmund entered with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself entirely in the right, offering a shallow bow that Nathaniel did not return. "Your Grace," Edmund said smoothly, "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I understand a young woman in my former employ has taken refuge within your household. Margaret Whitfield. I have come to collect her." "Miss Whitfield is employed here as a translator," Nathaniel said, his voice carefully even, betraying none of the anger tightening beneath it. "She is not a possession to be collected, Mr. Price, and this is not a matter that concerns you any longer." Edmund's smile did not waver, though something colder entered his eyes. "I fear it very much concerns me, Your Grace. Miss Whitfield left my mother's household under circumstances that have not yet been fully resolved. Items of value went missing shortly before her departure, and I am afraid the evidence points rather clearly toward her involvement. I had hoped to handle the matter discreetly, out of some lingering fondness for her, but if she refuses to return and account for herself, I will have no choice but to bring the matter before a magistrate. You are accusing her of theft. I am stating facts that concern my family's household, Your Grace. Facts I would rather not air publicly if it can be avoided. It would reflect poorly on everyone involved, myself and Miss Whitfield both, and I understand a man of your position would prefer to avoid scandal touching his own house as well." Edmund's tone remained pleasant, almost apologetic, though the threat beneath it was unmistakable. "I only wish to resolve this quietly, surely you understand." Nathaniel felt the full weight of the threat land exactly where Edmund intended it to, a careful, calculated blow, aimed not at Margaret directly, but at the reputation Nathaniel had spent his entire adult life protecting. He understood, with sudden clarity, precisely how Edmund had cornered Margaret so completely in the first place. The man did not raise his voice or make crude demands. He simply laid out consequences with the calm, reasonable tone of someone discussing the weather, allowing the listener's own fear to do the rest of the work. "I understand a great deal more than you realize, Mr. Price," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping into something colder and harder than before. "I understand that a young woman fled your household in the middle of the night, rather than remain a single day longer under your attentions. I understand that accusations of theft appeared only after she refused you, and not before. I have some familiarity with how such schemes are constructed, having encountered lesser versions of them among lesser men. You will find, Mr. Price, that I am considerably less easily maneuvered than a governess with no family and no protection." Something flickered across Edmund's composed expression, a brief crack in the careful mask, quickly smoothed over. "You misunderstand my intentions entirely, Your Grace." "I do not believe I do." Nathaniel took a single step closer, his voice low and precise. "You will leave my estate now, Mr. Price, and you will not return. If you attempt to bring false accusations before any magistrate, you will find that I have resources and connections considerably beyond those of your family, and I will use every one of them to ensure the truth of your conduct toward Miss Whitfield becomes known throughout every household of consequence in this county. Weigh that carefully before you decide your next course of action." Edmund's jaw tightened, the pleasant mask finally slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "You are making a grave error, Your Grace, defending a servant's word against mine." "I am defending the truth against a coward's threats," Nathaniel said. "Now leave, before I have you removed by force." For a long, tense moment, Edmund did not move, his eyes calculating, weighing whether the Duke's resolve was genuine or merely performance. Whatever he saw in Nathaniel's expression convinced him it was the former, and he finally offered a stiff, shallow bow before turning toward the door. "This is not finished," he said, pausing at the threshold. "You have made an enemy today, Your Grace, over a woman who is not even worth the trouble." "Get out of my house," Nathaniel said, and Edmund left without another word, though the cold promise in his final glance suggested the matter was far from resolved. Margaret, who had been informed of the confrontation only after it concluded, found Nathaniel alone in his study some time later, staring out the window at the empty drive where Edmund's carriage had disappeared into the distance. "You should not have confronted him yourself," she said quietly from the doorway. "If he brings this before a magistrate, your involvement will only complicate matters further. I could not stand by and let him threaten you under my own roof," Nathaniel said, turning to face her. Whatever complications follow, I do not regret it. You do not understand what you have risked, Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly with a fear she had kept carefully hidden until now. Edmund is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. He will find another way to strike, and I fear it will not be aimed only at me any longer. I cannot be the reason your reputation suffers, Your Grace. I cannot be the reason your engagement to Lady Beatrice collapses under scandal that was never yours to carry. Perhaps I no longer wish to carry an engagement that was never truly mine to begin with, Nathaniel said quietly, before seeming to catch himself and pull back from the admission. Margaret's breath caught, but she did not allow herself to dwell on the implication. Regardless, I think it best that I leave Rothbury Hall, tonight, if possible. I will not be the cause of your ruin, whatever affection has grown between us these past weeks. Margaret, please, Your Grace, let me go quietly, before Edmund finds another way to make my presence here a weapon against you. Her voice cracked slightly on the final words, though she held herself upright, refusing to let the tears gathering in her eyes fall in front of him. I have caused enough difficulty for one household. Nathaniel crossed the room quickly, closing the distance between them, though he stopped short of touching her, some careful restraint holding him back even now. You have caused nothing but a difficulty I am entirely willing to bear, Margaret. Do not run from this, not now. I must, she whispered, for your sake, if not my own. She turned and left the study before he could argue further, before the ache building in her chest could betray her into staying against every instinct warning her to leave. Nathaniel did not follow immediately, torn between the desire to chase after her and the understanding that forcing the issue further might only deepen her fear. That evening, Beatrice found him still in the study, his expression distant and troubled in a way she had rarely seen. You look as though you have lost something valuable, Nathaniel, she observed, settling into the chair across from his desk with deliberate casualness. Trouble with your translator, perhaps? Nathaniel's eyes sharpened, some instinct warning him that Beatrice's question was not idle curiosity. What do you know of the matter, Beatrice? Only what any observant person might notice, watching the two of you these past weeks. Beatrice's smile was thin, edged with something colder beneath the practiced elegance. I confess, I have made a few inquiries of my own. Miss Whitfield's history is rather more complicated than she has let on, wouldn't you agree? A cold, sinking dread settled in Nathaniel's chest. What have you done, Beatrice? Only what was necessary to protect my own interests, Nathaniel. Surely you understand that better than anyone. Beatrice rose, smoothing her skirts with unhurried precision. I suggest you consider carefully what you are risking, before you allow a governess with a questionable past to jeopardize everything our families have arranged. She left him alone with that warning hanging in the air, and Nathaniel sat in the growing darkness of his study, understanding with sudden cold clarity that the danger to Margaret had multiplied far beyond a single desperate man at his gates, and that Beatrice's careful, patient calculations might prove even more dangerous than Edmund's clumsy threats had ever been. He remained there long after the candles burned low, turning over every conversation he had shared with Beatrice these past weeks, searching for the moment her suspicion had hardened into something more deliberate. He recalled her pointed questions at dinner, her careful attention to Margaret's manner of speech, the letter Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned, sent to an address none of the staff recognized. Beatrice had been building a case with the same patient precision she applied to everything in her life, and Nathaniel had been too consumed with his own growing feelings toward Margaret to see the danger assembling itself in plain view. He thought of his father, a man who had taught him early that a duke's power lay not in grand gestures but in quiet, careful vigilance, in noticing the small threats before they became large ones. Nathaniel had failed that lesson these past weeks, distracted by warmth he had not felt in years, and now two separate dangers circled Margaret from opposite directions, each one patient, each one convinced of its own righteousness. He rose finally and walked the darkened corridors of his own house, past the closed door of Margaret's room, where no light showed beneath the frame. He did not knock. Whatever comfort he wished to offer, he understood she needed rest more than reassurance tonight, and he forced himself to continue past her door toward his own chambers, though sleep proved as elusive for him as it likely did for her. The following morning, Nathaniel summoned Mrs. Hargrove to his study before breakfast, closing the door carefully behind her. I need you to learn everything you can about the letter Lady Beatrice sent last week, he said without preamble. Where it was addressed, and if possible, what response it may have already received. Mrs. Hargrove's expression remained composed, though her eyes sharpened with understanding. I will see what can be learned, Your Grace, though I must caution you that Lady Beatrice has been careful. She does not trust the staff easily, and she has taken pains to keep her correspondence private. Do what you can, discreetly. I do not wish to alert her that we suspect anything further than ordinary curiosity. May I ask, Your Grace, what you intend to do if your suspicions prove correct?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letters still scattered across his desk from the previous day's business, though his mind was entirely elsewhere. "I intend to protect Margaret, whatever that requires, even if it means finally admitting to myself what I have been avoiding these past weeks." Mrs. Hargrove's expression softened, the careful neutrality of a long-time servant giving way, briefly, to something warmer. "Your father would have been proud to hear you say that, Your Grace. He always believed a man's true character showed clearest in how fiercely he protected those who had no power to protect themselves." She left to begin her quiet inquiries, and Nathaniel turned his attention to the day ahead, though his thoughts remained fixed on Margaret, on the fear he had seen in her eyes the previous evening, and on the growing certainty that he could no longer pretend his feelings toward her were merely those of an employer toward a valued translator. Margaret, for her part, spent the morning in the study attempting to focus on her work, though the stack of letters before her went largely untouched. She kept turning over Nathaniel's words from the previous evening, the admission he had nearly made before catching himself, the warmth in his voice that she had tried so hard not to notice these past weeks. She told herself, again and again, that leaving remained the wisest course, the only course that did not risk dragging him further into danger on her behalf. But when she tried to picture herself walking away from Rothbury Hall, from the horse who had first found her, from Mrs. Hargrove's quiet kindness, from Nathaniel's steady, unwavering presence, she found the picture harder to hold on to than she expected. Somewhere in these past weeks, without her quite noticing it happen, this house had become something she was no longer certain she could bear to lose. She was still lost in these thoughts when a servant appeared at the study door, informing her that a letter had arrived for her specifically, delivered by a rider who had not waited for a reply. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, and her breath caught as she recognized the handwriting immediately. Edmund had not given up. The letter was brief, cold, and precise, informing her that unless she returned to his household within the week and confirmed the theft accusations herself, sparing his family the difficulty of a public inquiry, he would proceed to a magistrate with evidence he claimed had already been gathered against her. He made no mention of Nathaniel, no direct threat toward Rothbury Hall, but the implication sat clearly beneath every carefully chosen word. Margaret understood, reading it a second time, that Edmund intended to make her choice appear as though it were entirely her own, a quiet capitulation rather than an open confrontation that might draw further attention to his own conduct. She sat with the letter clutched in trembling hands for a long time, weighing an impossible choice: return to Edmund and face whatever fate he had planned for her, or remain at Rothbury Hall and risk the scandal spreading to consume Nathaniel's reputation along with her own. Neither option offered any true safety, and the weight of the decision pressed down on her until she could barely draw a steady breath. By evening, she had made her choice. She would leave before dawn, quietly, without waking the household, and disappear somewhere far enough that neither Edmund nor Beatrice's growing suspicions could follow. It was not a solution exactly, only a postponement of the inevitable reckoning, but it was the only path she could see that did not require anyone else to suffer for choices that had never truly been hers to make. She packed the small bag she had arrived with weeks earlier, added a few items Mrs. Hargrove had quietly provided since, and sat awake through the final hours of darkness, watching the candle burn low, listening to the quiet house settle around her one final time before she left it behind for good. Nathaniel discovered Margaret gone before the sun had fully risen. He had come to the study early, as he often did now, hoping to catch her before the day's correspondence began, only to find the room empty and undisturbed, the desk cleared of the personal items that had accumulated there over the past weeks. A cold dread settled in his chest even before Mrs. Hargrove confirmed what he already suspected, her expression grave as she reported that Margaret's room stood empty, her borrowed clothes folded neatly on the bed, her small traveling bag gone. "When?" Nathaniel asked, already moving toward the door. "Sometime before dawn, Your Grace. None of the staff saw her leave. She must have gone through the garden gate, away from the main watch." Nathaniel did not wait to hear more. He called for his horse to be saddled immediately, ignoring the questioning looks of the stable hands as he swung up onto the stallion's back with more urgency than grace. The animal, sensing his rider's distress, needed no further encouragement, breaking into a swift canter the moment Nathaniel gave him his head. He rode toward the road Margaret would most likely have taken, the same direction from which she had first stumbled into his life weeks earlier, and found himself struck by the strange symmetry of it, searching now for the woman his horse had once found sleeping and alone. He pushed the stallion faster, scanning the hedgerows and fields on either side of the road, his mind cycling through every possible danger that might have already found her. He thought of Edmund, patient and calculating, perhaps already aware of her departure and waiting somewhere along this same road. He thought of the letter Mrs. Hargrove had never fully traced, of Beatrice's cold, careful warnings, of every threat that had circled Margaret these past weeks, finally converging on a single desperate morning. The fear that gripped him was unlike anything he had felt in years, sharper and more consuming than any political maneuvering or business risk had ever produced. The road stretched long and empty before him, winding past fields still silvered with the last traces of morning frost. Nathaniel passed a farmer's cart, a shepherd moving his flock across a distant hillside, and neither sight offered any comfort, only the growing, gnawing fear that he might already be too late. He thought of every mile Margaret must have walked alone weeks ago, cold and hungry and frightened, and understood now, with the clarity only true fear could bring, exactly how much courage that solitary journey had required. The stallion seemed to sense the urgency driving his rider, covering the uneven ground with a speed that would have alarmed Nathaniel under any other circumstance. He scanned every bend in the road, every stand of trees where a smaller figure might have paused to rest, his heart lifting and falling with each false hope that resolved into empty hedgerow or distant farmhouse. He found her nearly 2 hours later, resting briefly beneath the shade of an old oak tree at a crossroads some distance from the estate, her bag set beside her, her expression weary but resolute. She startled at the sound of hoofbeats approaching, relief and dismay warring across her face when she recognized him. "You should not have followed me," she said as he dismounted, though her voice lacked conviction. "You should not have left," Nathaniel replied, closing the distance between them in quick strides. "Margaret, running will not solve this. It will only leave you vulnerable, exhausted, and alone, exactly as I found you the first time." "I cannot let you sacrifice everything for my sake," Margaret said, her composure finally cracking, tears gathering that she had held back through the long, cold walk. "Edmund has threatened to bring false charges before a magistrate unless I return. Beatrice suspects enough of the truth to ruin us both if she chooses. I would rather disappear quietly than watch either of you destroyed because of me. And I would rather face every threat Edmund Price and Beatrice Colville can devise than watch you walk away," Nathaniel said, his voice fierce with an intensity that startled them both. "Margaret, I have spent years building a life of careful distance, certain that attachment only invited betrayal. You have undone that certainty in the span of a few short weeks, and I find I do not wish to return to the man I was before you arrived." Margaret's breath caught, tears finally spilling despite her efforts to hold them back. "You do not know what you are saying." "I know precisely what I am saying." Nathaniel reached out, gently taking her hands in his, the first true touch they had allowed themselves since the night in the study. "I am saying that I love you, Margaret Whitfield, and I will not let you disappear from my life over threats made by men and women who have no true claim on either of our happiness." For a long moment, Margaret could not speak, the weight of his words settling over her like warmth after weeks of cold. "I love you as well," she finally whispered, the admission trembling but certain. "I have for some time now, though I told myself it could never be more than foolish hope." "Then let it be more," Nathaniel said. "Come back with me. Face this together, rather than alone. I promise you, whatever Edmund threatens, whatever Beatrice attempts, I will not let either of them succeed." Margaret hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, allowing him to help her onto the horse before mounting behind her, one arm secure around her waist as they turned back toward Rothbury Hall. The ride home felt different from the desperate pursuit that had brought him to her. Slower, steadier, carrying the quiet certainty of two people who had finally stopped running from what stood plainly between them. They arrived to find the household in a state of quiet upheaval, Mrs. Hargrove waiting anxiously at the entrance with news that could not wait. "Your Grace, Lady Beatrice has been asking for you urgently since you departed. I believe you should speak with her before anything else occurs." Nathaniel helped Margaret down from the horse, his expression hardening with resolve. "Where is she?" "The drawing room, Your Grace. She seemed agitated." Nathaniel found Beatrice pacing the length of the drawing room, a letter clutched in her hand, her usual composure noticeably frayed. She turned sharply when he entered, her eyes flicking briefly to Margaret standing just behind him, before returning to Nathaniel with something that looked almost like desperation. "Nathaniel, we must speak privately." "Whatever you have to say, you may say in front of Margaret," Nathaniel said firmly. "I am done with secrets in this household, Beatrice." Beatrice's jaw tightened, but she seemed to recognize the futility of further evasion. "Very well. I received a response to my inquiry regarding Miss Whitfield's history. It seems Edmund Price has been rather less discreet than I anticipated. My correspondent, a distant cousin acquainted with the Price family, informed me of certain details Edmund did not intend to become widely known. What details? Nathaniel asked, though something in Mrs. Hargrove's earlier grave expression had already prepared him for what might follow. It seems Edmund's mother discovered, quite recently, that several items of missing jewelry she had believed stolen were, in fact, misplaced by her own carelessness, found eventually in a drawer she had forgotten she used for storage. The theft accusation against Miss Whitfield appears to have been entirely fabricated by Edmund himself, constructed after Miss Whitfield refused his attentions, precisely as she claimed. Beatrice's voice carried an edge of something Nathaniel had rarely heard from her before, something close to guilt. My cousin also mentioned that Edmund's own household staff have grown increasingly troubled by his behavior toward the household's female servants, a pattern, it seems, rather than an isolated incident. Margaret's hand found the doorframe for support, the confirmation of what she had always known to be true landing with unexpected weight now that it came from an outside source. Then the theft accusation was entirely false. It appears so, Beatrice said, and for the first time since her arrival at Rothbury Hall, something almost resembling shame crossed her composed features. I had intended to use this information to strengthen the case against you, Miss Whitfield, believing it would confirm rather than disprove Edmund's accusations. I did not anticipate learning that you had told the truth from the very beginning. The room fell silent for a long moment before Nathaniel spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that made both women turn toward him fully. Beatrice, I think it is time we spoke honestly about our own arrangement as well. Beatrice's composure faltered further. Nathaniel, our families arranged this match for reasons neither of us ever chose freely. I have known for some time that neither of us harbors true affection for the other, only obligation. I believe you know this as well, given how readily you turned to schemes against Margaret rather than address the growing distance between us directly. Nathaniel's tone remained gentle, despite the firmness of his words. I cannot marry you, Beatrice, not when my heart belongs entirely to someone else. I release you from our engagement, effective immediately, and I will ensure your family understands the decision was mine alone, so no scandal attaches to your name. Beatrice stared at him for a long moment, an entire lifetime of expectation and obligation visibly shifting behind her eyes, before something like relief finally broke through her carefully maintained composure. I confess, Nathaniel, I have felt the same distance for quite some time, though pride kept me from admitting it. Perhaps this releases us both from a match neither of us truly wanted. Perhaps it does, Nathaniel agreed. Beatrice's gaze shifted to Margaret, something complicated passing across her expression, equal parts resignation, and, unexpectedly, a measure of respect. I owe you an apology, Miss Whitfield. My actions these past weeks were unworthy of the woman I wish to believe myself to be. I hope you will accept my regret, however late it comes. I accept it, Margaret said quietly, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. In the days before her departure, Beatrice sought Margaret out once more, this time without any trace of her earlier coldness. She found her in the garden, tending to a small bed of late autumn roses Mrs. Hargrove had shown her how to prune, and stood at a careful distance until Margaret noticed her presence. I owe you more than a single apology, Beatrice said, her voice quieter than Margaret had ever heard it. I have spent my whole life being taught that security mattered more than affection, that a well-arranged match was worth any sacrifice required to protect it. I saw you as a threat to that security, and I was prepared to do considerable harm to preserve something that was never going to make either Nathaniel or myself happy in the end. We were both trapped by circumstances neither of us chose, Margaret said, setting down her shears. I understand the fear that drives a person to protect what little security they believe they have. I do not hold it against you, not entirely. You are more generous than I would be, in your position. Beatrice managed a small, genuine smile. I hope you find in Nathaniel everything our arrangement never could have offered either of us. He deserves it, and from what I have observed these past weeks, so do you. The two women parted on terms neither could have imagined possible when Beatrice first arrived at Rothbury Hall, and Margaret found herself, unexpectedly, wishing the other woman well as her carriage disappeared down the long drive. Beatrice departed Rothbury Hall within the week, her engagement formally dissolved. Her family's disappointment softened considerably by Nathaniel's careful diplomacy in ensuring no blame fell publicly upon her. The matter of Edmund Price, however, required more decisive action, and Nathaniel spent the following days working with a magistrate of unquestionable integrity to ensure the truth of Edmund's fabricated accusations became formally documented, protecting Margaret from any future attempt to revive the false claims against her. The magistrate Nathaniel consulted, a stern and thorough man named Ambrose Kent who had served the county for over 20 years, took the matter with the seriousness it deserved. He interviewed the household staff Edmund employed, several of whom, once assured their own positions were not at risk, spoke candidly of behavior they had long been too frightened to report. A pattern emerged quickly, corroborating every detail Margaret had shared, and within days a formal record existed establishing clearly that the theft accusations against her held no foundation whatsoever. Edmund attempted, briefly, to salvage his position by claiming the servants had been coerced or bribed into false testimony, but the sheer volume of consistent accounts made such a defense impossible to sustain. His own mother, once presented with the evidence, withdrew what little support she had offered him, horrified to learn the extent of her son's conduct toward the young women in her household's employ. Word of Edmund's conduct spread quickly through the county once the truth became known, his reputation crumbling under the weight of his own schemes, while Margaret found herself, for the first time in years, free of the fear that had shadowed every decision she made. She stood in the garden one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and amber, and felt something she had nearly forgotten how to recognize. Safety. Genuine, unthreatened safety, built not on hiding but on truth, finally brought fully into the light. She thought back over the weeks since that cold morning in the paddock, how impossible it would have seemed then that she might stand in this same garden, unafraid, waiting not for danger to find her but for a man she loved to join her beneath a darkening sky. The vicar's daughter who had once believed independence meant trusting no one had learned, slowly and against every hard-earned instinct, that some trust was worth the risk it carried. Mrs. Hargrove watched from the kitchen window as Nathaniel crossed the lawn toward Margaret, and allowed herself a rare, private smile. She had served 3 generations of the Ashworth family, had watched Nathaniel's father build this estate into something sturdy and enduring, and had feared, these past several years, that the son had inherited only the duty of that legacy and none of its warmth. Watching him now, unguarded and eager as he crossed the grass toward the woman waiting for him, she felt certain that fear had finally been laid to rest. Nathaniel found her there, as the last colors faded from the sky, and took her hand without hesitation, the two of them standing together in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to emerge over Rothbury Hall, the future stretching ahead of them for the first time unburdened by threat or obligation, shaped instead by choices both of them had finally made freely. "I still find it strange," Margaret said softly, breaking the quiet, "that all of this began with a horse who refused to move." Nathaniel laughed, a warm, unguarded sound she had come to treasure more than she once thought possible. "I have half a mind to retire him from all further duties. He accomplished the most important task of his life on that first cold morning, and nothing since could possibly compare. He deserves an extra measure of oats at the very least. He shall have it, every day for the rest of his life, and I will hear no argument from the stable master about spoiling him." Nathaniel drew her closer, resting his forehead lightly against hers. "Whatever comes next, Margaret, I do not intend to face it without you beside me." "Nor I without you," she answered, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future ahead of her felt like something to welcome rather than something to fear. 6 weeks after Edmund Price's final departure from Rothbury Hall, an invitation arrived that Nathaniel had been quietly planning since the day the magistrate's findings were formally recorded. The county's autumn assembly was among the largest social gatherings of the season, drawing every family of consequence within a 50-mile radius to a single grand ballroom for an evening of dancing, conversation, and the particular blend of scrutiny and spectacle that defined polite society. Nathaniel had attended every year of his adult life out of obligation rather than pleasure, and this year, he intended to attend for an entirely different reason. "You are certain about this," Margaret said, standing before the mirror in a gown of deep blue silk that Mrs. Hargrove had commissioned weeks earlier, without fully explaining why. "Everyone will be watching. Whatever whispers remain about Edmund's accusations, they will multiply the moment I walk through those doors beside you." "Let them whisper," Nathaniel said, adjusting his cravat in the reflection beside her. "I did not fight to clear your name simply to keep you hidden away afterward. You deserve to walk into that room with your head held high, Margaret, and I intend to be beside you when you do. And if Edmund is there, he will not dare show his face after what the magistrate uncovered. But if he does, I assure you, he will find considerably less sympathy in that ballroom than he anticipates." Nathaniel turned to face her fully, something warm and certain in his expression. "You have carried the weight of his lies long enough. Tonight, the truth carries the weight instead, and it favors you entirely. Mrs. Hargrove had insisted on seeing them off from the front steps, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she claimed was only needed because of the evening chill, though no one in the household believed that explanation for a moment. She had grown fond of Margaret over these past weeks, in a manner that went well beyond the ordinary courtesy owed to a guest, and watching her step into the carriage in a gown fit for a duchess brought a swell of pride the older woman had not expected to feel so keenly. "You look every bit the lady you have always been, miss," Mrs. Hargrove said, squeezing Margaret's hand briefly before the carriage door closed. "Whatever this evening brings, know that this household stands behind you completely." The carriage ride to the assembly hall passed in comfortable silence, Margaret's nerves settling gradually under the steady, reassuring presence of Nathaniel's hand resting over hers. She watched the passing countryside through the window, the same roads she had once walked alone and afraid now rolling past in comfort and safety, and marveled quietly at how quickly fortune could shift when courage was finally met with justice. When they arrived, the grand entrance already glittered with candlelight and the low hum of gathered conversation, and Margaret felt every instinct urging her to hesitate at the threshold. Nathaniel felt her hesitation and paused beside her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Whatever happens in that room tonight, you are not walking in alone, remember that." She drew a steadying breath and nodded, and together they entered the ballroom. The reaction was immediate, though not in the way Margaret had feared. Word of Edmund's disgrace had spread thoroughly through the county in the weeks since the magistrate's findings became public, and the whispers that followed Margaret's entrance carried curiosity and sympathy in equal measure, rather than the scorn she had braced herself to endure. Several matrons who had once employed governesses under similarly precarious circumstances approached her directly, offering quiet words of support that left her genuinely moved. Lady Colville, Beatrice's mother, found Margaret near the refreshment table partway through the evening, her expression carrying none of the coldness Margaret might have expected given the dissolved engagement. "My daughter has spoken well of you, Miss Whitfield, which I confess surprised me a great deal, given the circumstances. I understand you endured considerable difficulty before finding safety at Rothbury Hall." "I did, my lady, though I have been fortunate in the friends I found there." "Fortune had very little to do with it, from what I have heard," Lady Colville said, a knowing warmth in her eyes. "Courage, rather. I hope you know how rare it is to walk into a room like this one and hold your head high after what you endured. Many would not have managed it." Margaret thanked her, genuinely touched, and found herself, for the first time in the evening, beginning to relax. As the night wore on, she found herself drawn into conversation with several other guests, each exchange easier than the last. A retired colonel spoke admiringly of her father's parish work, recalling a charitable effort the vicar had organized decades earlier that had aided several families in the colonel's own regiment. A young woman named Charlotte, recently married and clearly still adjusting to the demands of managing her own household, sought Margaret's advice on matters of correspondence and accounts, having heard of her skill with languages and figures. Margaret answered every question with growing ease, no longer bracing herself for the sharp judgment she had expected to find at every turn. Nathaniel watched her from across the room during a brief interval when duty required him to greet a visiting earl, and felt a fierce, quiet pride swell in his chest at the sight of her, radiant and at ease among people who had, only months earlier, been prepared to believe the worst of her on nothing more than a stranger's accusation. He excused himself from the earl's company as soon as courtesy allowed, eager to return to her side. The orchestra shifted between lively reels and slower, more intimate pieces throughout the evening, and Nathaniel claimed at least 3 dances with Margaret over the course of the night, far more than propriety strictly required of a host with his engagement not yet formally announced, though few among the gathered guests seemed to mind the impropriety. If anything, the warmth between them as they moved through each dance only deepened the goodwill already building around them. During a brief pause between dances, as Margaret caught her breath near the refreshment table, an elderly gentleman she did not recognize approached with a courteous bow. "Miss Whitfield, I believe. I am told you once served as governess in the Price household." Margaret's stomach tightened instinctively, old fear rising before she could stop it, though the gentleman's expression carried nothing but sympathy. "I did, sir, though the circumstances of my departure were rather difficult." "So I have heard, and I am glad to see the truth of the matter has finally come to light. I sat on the county bench for many years before my retirement, and I have long suspected that young man's character ran considerably darker than his family's standing allowed most people to see. I am pleased justice found its way to you in the end, whatever the delay." He offered another small bow before moving on, leaving Margaret with a warmth in her chest that further loosened the tension she had carried into the evening. It was near midnight, as the orchestra began a slower, quieter piece, that Nathaniel found her again near the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens beyond the ballroom. He had disappeared briefly some minutes earlier, and Margaret had assumed him occupied with the usual demands of hosts and acquaintances that came with his position, until she noticed the sudden, unusual quiet that had fallen over the nearest cluster of guests. "Nathaniel?" she asked, turning to find him watching her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, equal parts nervousness and certainty. "I have something I wish to say to you, Margaret, and I find I would rather say it here, in front of everyone who once doubted the truth of your character, than in some quiet corner where only the two of us might hear it." His voice carried clearly enough that the nearby guests had already begun to notice, conversation dimming into curious attention around them. Margaret's breath caught. "Nathaniel, what are you doing?" He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and the last remaining conversation in their corner of the ballroom fell entirely silent. "Months ago, my horse refused to move from a field until I discovered the reason why. I found you there, exhausted and afraid, asking not for comfort but for warning of danger. In that single strange, unlikely moment, everything I believed about caution and distance began to unravel, though I did not fully understand it until much later." A soft murmur rippled through the gathering crowd, curious whispers rising as more guests turned to watch. "You arrived in my life with nothing but the clothes on your back, and a courage I have rarely encountered in anyone, of any station. You endured threats and lies that would have broken lesser resolve, and you met every one of them with a quiet, unshakable dignity that I have come to love more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anything." Nathaniel knelt before her, opening the box to reveal a ring set with a single, deep sapphire that caught the ballroom's candlelight like captured starlight. "I do not offer you security in exchange for anything, Margaret. I do not offer you a title as a solution to circumstances that frightened you. I offer you my whole heart, freely and completely, and I ask if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife, not out of necessity, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life without you beside me." The ballroom had gone entirely silent now, every eye fixed on the scene by the windows, and Margaret felt tears gathering that she made no effort to hide. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with a happiness she had never expected to feel so completely. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamations as Nathaniel rose and slid the ring onto her finger, drawing her into an embrace that neither of them cared to hide from the watching crowd. Lady Colville, standing nearby with tears of her own gathering in her eyes, began the applause that spread quickly through the entire gathering, and even those who had whispered doubtfully about Margaret's history only weeks earlier found themselves swept up in the genuine warmth of the moment. Near the edge of the crowd, unnoticed by most, a young footman who had once served in Edmund Price's household watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. He had been among those who testified to the magistrate about Edmund's conduct, risking his own position to speak the truth, and seeing Margaret's happiness now felt, to him, like proof that the risk had been worthwhile. Later that evening, as their carriage carried them back toward Rothbury Hall beneath a sky scattered with stars, Margaret rested her head against Nathaniel's shoulder, turning the sapphire ring gently on her finger. "I never imagined a night like this was possible," she said softly. "Weeks ago I was walking alone on a cold road, uncertain if I would survive to see morning. Tonight I stood in a ballroom full of people who once might have condemned me, and instead they celebrated with us. The truth has a way of finding its rightful place eventually," Nathaniel said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Though I confess, I am rather fond of the horse who insisted on finding you first." Margaret laughed, the sound warm and unguarded in the quiet carriage. "We really must find some way to properly reward him. I have already instructed the stable master to retire him from all further duties. He has more than earned a life of leisure and unlimited oats." They arrived back at Rothbury Hall well past midnight, the house dark and quiet except for a single lamp Mrs. Hargrove had left burning in the entrance hall, anticipating their late return. Nathaniel helped Margaret from the carriage, and before entering the house, they walked together to the stables, where the stallion who had begun it all stood waiting in his stall, nosing curiously at their approach. Margaret pressed her palm against his soft nose, the same gesture she had offered him countless times these past weeks, and felt a fullness in her heart that she could hardly begin to put into words. "Thank you," she whispered to the horse, "for refusing to leave me that morning." The stallion huffed softly, as though he understood perfectly well the role he had played, and Nathaniel, watching the two of them together, felt certain that whatever challenges still lay ahead in building a life together, he and Margaret would face them with the same steady resolve that had carried them both this far already. Above them, the stars continued their slow turn across the autumn sky, indifferent to the small, extraordinary happiness unfolding in the stable yard below, though Margaret found herself grateful, in that quiet moment, for every difficult step that had led her to this place, this house, and this man who had chosen her freely, without condition, exactly as she was. They lingered in the stable longer than either of them intended, reluctant to let the night end, trading quiet memories of the weeks that had brought them here. Nathaniel recalled the exact moment he had known his feelings toward her had shifted beyond simple concern, a morning weeks earlier when she had corrected his clumsy attempt at an Italian phrase with such patient amusement that he had found himself inventing further mistakes just to hear her laugh again. Margaret confessed, in turn, that she had first begun to trust him fully not during any grand gesture, but during a quiet evening when he had simply listened to her account of Edmund's threats without once suggesting she bore any blame for what had happened to her. "You never once made me feel as though I needed to earn my safety here," she said, resting her head against his shoulder as the stallion shifted contentedly in his stall beside them. "Every other place I sought refuge, there was always some quiet expectation attached, some debt I was meant to repay through gratitude or obedience. You never asked that of me. You had already survived more than most people ever will, simply by walking through my gates," Nathaniel said. "The least I could offer was safety without condition. I only hope I have managed to give you that." "You have given me far more than safety," Margaret said softly. "You have given me a life I did not believe I was permitted to want." They finally made their way inside, as the eastern sky began, faintly, to lighten toward dawn, Mrs. Hargrove having long since retired, though she had left instructions for a warm supper to be kept ready, in case the newly engaged couple returned hungry from their celebration. Margaret ate little, too full of happiness to attend properly to food, and Nathaniel watched her across the small kitchen table with an expression of such open contentment that even the housekeeper's absence could not diminish the warmth filling the quiet room. News of the engagement spread through the county within days, carried by the same eager whispers that had once threatened to destroy Margaret's reputation entirely. This time, however, the whispers carried admiration rather than suspicion, and letters of congratulation began arriving at Rothbury Hall from families who, only months earlier, might have hesitated to receive a governess of uncertain history into their drawing rooms at all. Margaret found the shift remarkable, though Nathaniel reminded her, gently, that the world's opinion had always mattered less than the truth of her own character, a truth that had never once wavered despite every attempt to convince her otherwise. Preparations for the wedding began almost immediately, Mrs. Hargrove throwing herself into the planning with an enthusiasm that left both Margaret and Nathaniel faintly overwhelmed, though neither had the heart to slow her down. Margaret wrote to a small number of trusted acquaintances from her years as a governess, women who had shown her kindness during difficult times, inviting them to witness a celebration she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Nathaniel, for his part, quietly arranged for a modest sum to be settled on the household staff, who had shown Margaret particular kindness during her time of danger. A gesture of gratitude, he insisted, required no acknowledgement beyond the simple knowledge that it had been done. As the date of the wedding approached, Margaret found herself, more than once, standing at the study window where she had first begun translating letters weeks earlier, watching the stallion graze in the paddock beyond, and marveling at the distance she had traveled since that cold, desperate morning when she had collapsed against his legs with nothing left to lose. The road that had brought her here had been long and frightening, but standing now on the threshold of a future chosen freely, she found she would not trade a single difficult step for an easier path that might never have led her to this place at all. 1 year had passed since the morning a duke's horse refused to move for anyone but the stranger sleeping at his feet, and Rothbury Hall looked, on this particular spring afternoon, nothing at all like the quiet, guarded house Margaret remembered from that first frightened arrival. The gardens had been replanted through the winter under Margaret's careful direction, rows of roses and lavender now filling the beds that had once held only Mrs. Hargrove's practical herbs, though the older woman had insisted on keeping a modest corner reserved for kitchen use, a compromise both women had reached with considerable good humor. Margaret stood among the blooming roses now, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face from the afternoon sun, watching Nathaniel cross the lawn toward her with the easy, unhurried gait of a man entirely at peace with his life. They had married in early winter, a modest ceremony by the standards of the aristocracy, though every person who mattered to either of them had been present. Beatrice had attended, somewhat to everyone's surprise, seated beside her own new fiancé, a quiet gentleman farmer she had met only months after her engagement to Nathaniel dissolved, a match she confessed suited her considerably better than the arrangement her family had once insisted upon. The two women, once wary rivals, had grown into an unlikely friendship over the intervening months, exchanging letters and the occasional visit, their earlier rivalry entirely forgotten in favor of a mutual respect neither had expected to find. Edmund Price's name had rarely surfaced in the year since the magistrate's ruling. What news did occasionally reach Rothbury Hall suggested he had left the county entirely, his family standing too damaged by the scandal to sustain his presence in society any longer. Margaret found she thought of him less and less as the months passed, his once terrifying influence over her life shrinking steadily into little more than a difficult memory, overshadowed by every happier moment that had followed. "You look thoroughly pleased with yourself," Nathaniel said, joining her among the roses, pressing a kiss to her temple as he settled beside her on the garden bench. "I was thinking of how strange it is to feel this settled," Margaret admitted. "A year ago I could not have imagined a single day without fear shadowing it somewhere. Now I wake each morning and the fear simply is not there anymore. I had nearly forgotten what that felt like." "I intend for it to remain that way for the rest of your life," Nathaniel said. "Though I confess our household has grown rather busier than either of us anticipated this past year." Margaret laughed, resting a hand over the small, gentle curve of her stomach, still barely noticeable beneath her gown, though it would not remain hidden much longer. "Busier still, come autumn. I have already informed the stable master that our future child shall have riding lessons the moment they are old enough to sit a saddle properly," Nathaniel said, a note of pure delight in his voice that still, even after a year of marriage, occasionally caught Margaret off guard with its unguarded warmth. He had been, she often thought, a man starved of simple happiness for far longer than he ever let on, and watching him embrace it so fully now brought her a joy nearly as deep as her own. "You have already spoiled that horse beyond all reasonable measure. I dread to think what indulgences await an actual child. He has earned every spoiling I offer him," Nathaniel said, glancing toward the paddock where the stallion, now well into a comfortable retirement, grazed lazily beneath the spring sun. "Without his stubbornness, none of this would exist. I consider it a debt I intend to keep paying for the rest of his days." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the horse graze, the roses swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. The entire estate settled into the particular peace that only comes after hardship has finally, fully passed. Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the garden gate some time later, carrying a tray of tea and a folded letter that had arrived with the afternoon post. "From Charlotte, Your Grace," she said, handing the letter to Margaret with a knowing smile. "She writes that her household accounts have finally balanced themselves, thanks to your advice, and she wishes to know if you might visit before summer to help her plan a similar garden to this one." Margaret smiled, tucking the letter away to answer properly later. She had, over the past year, become something of a quiet resource among the younger wives and daughters of the county's more modest households, offering practical guidance on matters of correspondence, accounts, and household management that she had once provided only as paid employment, now offered freely among friends who valued her knowledge and her company in equal measure. It was, she often reflected, precisely the sort of purpose she had once feared she would never be permitted to hold. A woman's intelligence valued for its own sake, rather than treated as an inconvenient exception to be tolerated. "You have built quite a reputation for yourself, Duchess," Nathaniel said, using the title with the same warm affection he always did, never quite losing the small thrill of pride it still brought him after a year of marriage. "I have built a life I once believed entirely beyond my reach," Margaret corrected gently. "The reputation is simply what followed." She thought sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, of the countless women still trapped in circumstances similar to the ones she had once endured, women without a stubborn horse or a compassionate duke to intervene on their behalf. It was this thought, more than any other, that had led her to quietly establish a small fund through the estate, offering discreet assistance to governesses and household servants who found themselves without recourse against unjust accusations or unwanted attentions from those who held power over their livelihoods. Nathaniel had supported the effort without hesitation the moment she proposed it, understanding immediately the significance it held for her. Mrs. Hargrove had become, in her own quiet way, an essential part of that effort, using her decades of connections among household staff throughout the county to identify young women who might benefit from a discreet word of support or a small measure of financial assistance during difficult transitions. It was slow, careful work, conducted without fanfare, but Margaret found it among the most meaningful pursuits of her new life, a way of ensuring that her own suffering had not been entirely without purpose. Charlotte mentioned in her letter that another young woman in her acquaintance has found herself in circumstances rather similar to your own, those years ago, Margaret said thoughtfully, setting her tea aside. I believe I shall write back and offer what assistance I can. Quietly, of course. Of course, Nathaniel agreed, no trace of surprise in his voice. He had long since grown accustomed to his wife's quiet determination to extend the same grace she had once received to others who needed it just as badly. Let me know if my involvement would be useful. I suspect a duke's letter carries weight a governess's testimony sometimes cannot. However unjust that imbalance remains. It remains deeply unjust, Margaret agreed. Which is precisely why we ought to use whatever advantage we hold to correct it. One small circumstance at a time. As evening approached, they walked together back toward the house, pausing as they always did near the stable to greet the horse who had begun their story, the animal nosing affectionately at Margaret's outstretched palm exactly as he had done every day since that first frozen morning a year earlier. Mrs. Hargrove watched them from the kitchen doorway, the light of the setting sun catching the warm gold of the house's old stone walls, and felt, not for the first time, a deep and settled gratitude for having lived long enough to see this particular chapter of the family story reach so happy a conclusion. Inside, a fire had already been lit against the gathering evening chill, and the household settled into its familiar, comfortable rhythm, the same rhythm that had grown steadily around Margaret since the day she first arrived, exhausted and afraid, asking only whether danger had followed her through the gates. It never truly had, not in any way that could touch her here. Not once Nathaniel had made his choice clear on that cold morning in the paddock, standing between her and every threat the world outside might still have wished to send. Later that night, as the household settled into sleep and the stars emerged once more over Rothbury Hall, Margaret stood at the window of the room that had once been unfamiliar and was now entirely her own, watching the moonlight fall softly across the paddock below. She thought of the frightened, exhausted woman who had collapsed there a year ago, certain her life had reached its lowest possible point, and marveled at how completely that moment of despair had transformed into the foundation of everything she now held dear. Nathaniel joined her at the window, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders, and together they watched the quiet night settle over the estate that had become, in every sense that mattered, truly home. Whatever comes next, Margaret said softly, I find I am no longer afraid to meet it. Nor I, Nathaniel answered, so long as I meet it beside you. Outside, the old stallion shifted quietly in his stall, standing watch, as he always had, over the family he had somehow known, on that first cold morning, was worth protecting long before either of them had understood it themselves. In the years that would follow, Margaret often found herself telling the story of that morning to whoever asked how a duke and a runaway governess had found their way to one another, and she never once tired of it, though she told it a little differently each time, depending on the listener. To the young women she quietly helped through her small fund, she emphasized the courage it had taken to run rather than surrender to a false accusation. To Nathaniel's more skeptical relations, who occasionally raised an eyebrow at the unconventional beginning of their marriage, she emphasized instead the steady, patient character of the man who had chosen truth over convenience, even when it cost him a carefully arranged engagement. But to their own child, once old enough to understand it, she would tell the story exactly as it had happened, without embellishment, because she had learned by then that the truth needed no exaggeration to feel remarkable. A stubborn horse, a frightened woman, a duke willing to trust his own instincts over the comfortable certainties he had built his life upon. It was, she would say, the simplest story in the world, and also the most important one she had ever lived. The house settled fully into night around them, the fire burning low in the grate, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, exactly as they had on the evening of Nathaniel's proposal, exactly as they would on countless evenings still to come. Margaret closed her eyes against Nathaniel's shoulder, grateful beyond words for the strange, unlikely path that had carried her from a frozen field to this warm and settled home, and allowed herself, at last, the simple luxury of feeling entirely, completely safe.